Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Naomi, and we're really excited to kick off our three-part webinar series on radon. Before we dive into the actual presentation, I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded, and all attendees will be muted for the webinar, but there will be an opportunity to verbally ask questions at the end. If you would like to do this, please raise your hand and we'll be very happy to unmute you so you can ask that question. There's also a Q&A option in the Zoom toolbar. Now, please make sure that you use the Q&A box versus the chat box to ask any questions. You're welcome to chat throughout the webinar, but any questions that are in the Q&A will be ones that are answered by Bruce. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll be having time to answer them at the end of the presentation. If you do run into any technical difficulties, normally logging in and out of Zoom will solve those issues. And if you do have continued issues, feel free to email learning@ecoh.ca and we'll do our best to help you out. And lastly, we'd really appreciate 3 minutes of your time to complete a short survey at the end of the webinar. This feedback really helps us to continually improve the services and the webinar information that we give to you. So I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about ECOH here. So ECOH has been serving our clients for nearly 25 years. Next year, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. ECOH is an acronym for Environmental Consulting Occupational Health. We have service hubs in both Mississauga and Ottawa, but we're active right across Canada. And we have more than 75 professionally accredited employees on our staff. We serve a variety of client sectors, which you can see here today, and many more besides. We have 3 main teams of experts, technicians, and project managers, and we operate in a wide variety of specialties. Our environmental team performs phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, excess soil management, and much more. Our hazardous materials department is busy performing asbestos surveys, management plans, and assessments for lead, PCBs, and many other hazardous materials, as you can see here. And our occupational health and safety team, which is headed up by our expert here today, Bruce Decker, is dedicated to helping you and our clients protect their people and property from water damage, mold, indoor air quality concerns, health and safety audits, and last and most relevant today, radon investigations and mitigation. Just wanted to touch briefly on the agenda. We're going to be covering quite a few interesting topics today. And mostly we're going to be digging into the basics of radon. What is it? Where does it come from? How does it impact your body? Quite a fascinating study. And then Bruce is going to be talking about assessing for radon. How do we sample and test for it? He's going to be doing an overview of mitigation and an overview of legislation. So I say overview because we're going to be diving into more detail in webinars 2 and 3, which are to come. Stay tuned for that information. And so I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Bruce Decker, who is ECOH's Director of Health and Safety, has over 28 years of experience assessing and mitigating radon in Canada for 15 of those years. Bruce is a director of, on a board of directors, for the Canadian Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists, CAST, and he's presented to organizations on this topic, such as the Toronto Construction Association, City of Hamilton, Ontario Building Envelope Council, and many more. Bruce is passionate about radon. I've learned a lot from Bruce over the past few weeks he's been with ECOH, and he is a self-professed radon geek. You'll find out more about that today. And he is committed to remaining at the forefront of radon regulatory updates, emerging assessment and mitigation technologies, and being involved in cross-Canada radon studies. So you really are listening to one of Canada's most esteemed experts on radon. He's a registered assessor under the Canadian National Radon Proficiency Program, or C-NRPP for a slightly less mouthful. And he's bringing to our webinar today an incomparable wealth of knowledge and experience to this webinar series. And so without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Bruce. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Naomi. And thank you everyone for joining and coming to the webinar. There's some familiar faces in the crowd, and I am new to ECOH, but I'm certainly not new to the industry. And for the past 7 years, all I have been doing is measuring radon across the country and mitigating commercial buildings. So yeah, this is very fresh with me right now. So happy to help. And again, I'm sure all your questions won't be answered with the first, second, or third webinar, but by all means, you're more than welcome to contact me. As self-proclaimed radon geeks, we always like to help educate people so they can make the best decisions for them. Okay, so right into it. The basics of radon. What's radon and where is it found? Okay, quite simply put, radon is radiation. It is the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers, and it's responsible for killing more than 3,000 Canadians annually. It's invisible, odorless, and tasteless, so we have no idea whether it's around us or not, right? But I can guarantee you it's around us all the time, indoors and out. It's present in all buildings, and it can reach quite high levels in buildings, which is really the reason why we're here. Now, where does it come from? Well, it's not a contaminant somebody placed there. It comes from the natural decay of uranium, which is found all over the Earth's crust. So it's in the ground, it's in the soil. You don't have to be sitting on rock, because rock is made up of soil is made up of bits of ground up rock. So, and remember, 4 major glaciations happened in Canada, and they've bulldozed a lot of that rock material farther south. So it's in the soil, guaranteed it's going to be there, and it enters the building anywhere the buildings contact the ground. And 28 years experience and more, I found that all buildings tend to touch the ground in one way or another. So all buildings are susceptible. So when the radon does find its way into the building and it can accumulate to higher levels, the occupants inhale that radon and they receive an internal dose of radiation, which is much different than an external dose. So that's one of the reasons why radon is such a concern. It's an internal dose. So the assessment and control of any workplace hazard, and including radon, is in occupational health and safety law in some mechanism or another. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on. So this is just a basic schematic of how radon will find its way into a building. Remember, uranium is a solid, and as it undergoes nuclear decay and it eventually gets to radon, it turns to a gas. And that gas can move through the pore space in the soils. And it can find its way into the building through the foundation or wherever the building touches the ground, through cracks, holes, services. And these don't have to be, bad cracks from poor construction. These are typical, hairline cracks that exist in normal good construction. The lion's share of it is around that point where the floor slab meets the concrete wall. There can be, there usually is a very small crack there. Sometimes it can be quite big, but that's where the lion's share of it comes from. Right? So, and you can't build a building without some kind of crack in the foundation. If you're on well water, there is the possibility that radon is going to enter the building through that water system, because radon gas will dissolve in water, and you're pumping it into the building and then aerosolizing it via a shower. Typically, that doesn't happen too much in commercial buildings, but it can happen in things like hatcheries or areas where you have a lot of processed water that might be coming from a well. So not something to completely discount, but the lion's share of what we worry about is the soil gas coming in through the foundation. Now, when I first started in radon, everybody said, well, we need a map. We need a map. Tell me where there's a map and tell me where I need to test and I don't need to test. So there is a radon map of Canada. It's called the Radon Potential Map of Canada. And this is produced by Radon Corp, Radon Environmental Corp. And it has a bunch of geological data that gives you a potential idea of where radon may be more prevalent in Canada and in a building. And you'll note that it's listed into 3 zones. Red zone is high, the green zone is elevated, and the blue zone is guarded. Now, in layperson's terms, you could consider those high, medium, and low. But the US did that when they came out with their map, and they found out that people would look at the low area and say, oh, I'm in a low area, I don't need to test. And that's not the case. We, as an association, and many of our members have found buildings that are over the acceptable radon level in many of the areas listed as guarded. So that's why we in Canada use the term guarded, because you're never sure. There's just too many factors on how the building interacts with the ground. So you can't just leave it on geographical principles of sitting on a high source or not. So if you notice, though, roughly about 80% of the most densely populated areas in Canada sit on high radon potential or elevated radon potential. So there is quite a significant situation. And I believe that Saskatchewan, if it was its own country, would rank 6th highest in the world for radon. Okay. But the key thing to take out of this is no matter where you are on the map, or no matter where your building or your site is on the map, you need to test your home and workplace. The only way to know how much radon you have in your building is to test. And that's also Health Canada's advice, right? Regardless of what any study shows, the only way to know is to test. A little bit of science here, because we're going to talk about it. We measure radon in units called becquerels per cubic meter, and that's becquerels per cubic meter of air. A becquerel is a nuclear disintegration per second. So think of that as a tick in a Geiger counter. Okay, that's an actual decay. As I mentioned earlier, radon's everywhere, right? It's naturally occurring, so it's going to be everywhere. And there's going to be an outdoor concentration because it's in the ground, turns into a gas, and it's going to find its way out through the grass, through the fields. And outdoors, typically you get anywhere from about 5 to 15. And indoors, we've seen levels about 10, but we've also seen levels greater than 10,000 becquerels. So significant spread in what's found indoors. Health Canada did a cross-country study a number of years ago, and they've actually done more studies, and we're waiting for that additional report to come out. But it was 14,000 homes across Canada, and they found that approximately 7% of homes across the country exceed the action level. That might not seem like a lot, but if you consider the amount of people in the homes, that's a significant amount of people that are overexposed to radiation. Federal government tested their buildings, and they found that about 4% of commercial style buildings tend to exceed the action level of 200 becquerels from Health Canada. And with my 7 years experience of testing just commercial buildings, thousands of them across Canada, I find very, very similar results. So what are the health impacts of radon? We're going to talk a little bit about how it impacts the body without getting into too much medical science. Again, we're just covering the basics here. But it's a specific type of radiation that we're really concerned about. It's alpha radiation, and the cause is lung cancer. That's it. Radon causes lung cancer. I usually find to try and help people visualize radon, this little video works quite well. This is a cloud chamber, and it's basically a vessel filled with saturated alcohol atmosphere, and it's been super cooled. So similarly to how a jet would fly through the air and it leaves a vapor trail behind it, as the radon or nuclear decay happens in this atmosphere, it leaves a little vapor trail and a streak. Whoops, sorry about that. And so what's happened here is they've injected air, which has radon in it. And this, from what I understand with the video, is around 200 becquerels. So every streak you see there is an alpha or a beta decay. So this is actually radon blasting through the air. So if you inhale this air, this is happening within your lung tissue, okay? And it's an internal dose causing a lot of damage. Okay? So remember, 200 becquerels per cubic meter of air, and that's 200 disintegrations every second. So that's a lot to wrap your head around. So how does radon cause lung cancer? Well, as I discussed earlier, there's uranium in the soil. It works along decay to radium, and then it becomes a gas where it moves into the building. And radon itself emits alpha particles, but it also then turns back into a solid, polonium, bismuth, and lead as the decay process goes along. And those particulates, or they then become a tiny fraction of dust, basically, so to speak, they can get lodged inside your lung tissue and not expelled back out. and they also continue to emit radiation. So what causes the vast exposure of your radiation is the polonium. It's not so much the radon. We use radon as a surrogate to measure because it's stable and it's what's inhalable, right? So, but again, a lot of science, basically, you're inhaling radiation and getting an internal dose of radiation. And those particles that remain lodged in your lungs will stay radioactive for decades until they reach stable lead. So it's decades of exposure. So what is alpha radiation? Well, it's 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It's just a helium nucleus. And as the molecule tries to stabilize itself, this gets ejected and it flies through the air. It has a lot of energy in it for irradiation. So it emits a very high amount of energy in a very short distance. And if you have some history or some knowledge, or you remember, high school physics, there's primary sources of radiation are alpha, beta, and gamma. And you think alpha doesn't penetrate very far, right? Or a layer of dead skin or some clothing can stop it. A sheet of paper will stop it. Whereas beta and gamma tend to penetrate through, okay? So you might be thinking, why are we so worried about it? But remember, there's a difference between the external exposure and the internal exposure. We're inhaling or taking that alpha into our body where there's no longer a layer of dead skin to protect our cells in our lungs. So that's one of the reasons it can cause so much damage. And I'm not saying don't go for an x-ray. If you need an x-ray, go for it. Your body will thank you. It's important information that the doctor gets from that. But usually beta and gamma radiation from an x-ray or something like that causes a single break in your DNA. So if you think of DNA as a ladder that's been twisted and you get a bit of radiation that comes and hits that DNA, it's going to cause a small break in a rung. So up on the top here, you can see, 1 or 2 little breaks. And then the DNA can find a way to heal itself. We have mechanisms that heal it. But when the alpha particle hits it, it causes double strand breaks. So it snaps that ladder clean in half and it creates a whole bunch of smaller fragments. So as your body's trying to repair it, there's a much greater chance of that repair being incorrect and resulting in a cancerous cell. So that's why radiation, alpha radiation inside your lungs is a big concern. So statistically, CAREX indicates that radon is the single highest priority of carcinogen exposure in Canada. So it's responsible for a significant amount of cancers. It actually exceeds the lifetime excess cancer risk of asbestos exposure. So if you look at this graph here, and it's a logarithmic graph, right? So if we look over at asbestos, it's about 1. And if you've ever dealt with building management, you know how regulated asbestos is and how much of a concern it is. So asbestos is 1, where radon over here is 10,000. Now, it's not to say that radon is more toxic than asbestos. Think about it. You're exposed to radon in a building that contacts the ground. So you're exposed to it all the time. Everybody's exposed to it all the time. Whereas asbestos, you have to be in a building that has asbestos-containing materials to be exposed. And typically, those materials have to be disturbed and kicked in the air for you to be exposed. So it's one of the reasons why radon's an issue, because it's a constant chronic exposure. Even at levels below the action level, you've got that chronic exposure, right? 16% of lung cancer deaths are related to radon. And that's too many. 188,000 Canadians are occupationally exposed to radon. And this graph breaks that down. And you can see that a lot of it is in the highly populated areas of the country, right? Okay. So what do we have to do? We need to assess and control radon. Luckily, we have some exposure limits, and it's not hard to test for. And if you test it and you find it's high in your building, it's fixable. It's not horrible to deal with, right? It's a lot easier, I think, than asbestos. But what are the requirements, right? Workplaces need to be tested under occupational health and safety law to protect workers from radon exposure. Quite simply, if a building has too much radon in it, you need to control the worker exposure to that radon. And usually that's done by fixing the building. And in Canada, with National Building Code, but particularly in Ontario, because this tends to be more of an Ontario-focused group that I'm talking to, it is impossible for you to build a building and meet code if you build it not resistant to radon entry and have mechanisms in it to make remediation of that radon easier. Okay. That's webinar number 3, though. Okay. So a little visual, how does radon enter the building? It doesn't sort of seep in. It gets hoovered in. It gets sucked into the building. Every building has something called stack effect in it, right? And it's more in high rises than it is in residential small buildings. But what happens is warm air in your house or in the building rises up because it's more buoyant, and it escapes through small building cracks in the upper levels. And that puts the basement or the lower levels under a little bit of suction. And we're talking thousands of an inch of water column. So incredibly small pressures that ventilation engineers would deem insignificant, but more than enough to pull in radon. So we have to remember that. Wind can cause pressure differentials in the building and cause some suction. The ventilation system, or the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, if it's not balanced properly, it can depressurize a building and suck radon in. I've seen that happen numerous times. Okay. And of course, occupant behaviors. Do the windows open? Do they not open? Where do people tend to spend their time? So how do those individuals operate the HVAC? So there's a lot of factors that affect how the radon gets in, which is why we have to test. The picture to the right is a good visual. Basically, some stage smoke has been injected underneath the floor slab of this house, and you can see the smoke billowing in. So if you could see radon enter a building, it would look something like that. Okay. But you can see the bulk of it is entering where that floor slab meets the wall. Okay. Okay. So natural background radiation versus indoor radiation, right? Again, it's a natural contaminant. What are we worried about, right? Well, if we lived in the field outside all the time, that would be okay. But we spend close to 90% of our time in our buildings. And living in a building isn't natural. Living in a building that sucks radiation from the soil into the building and concentrate it isn't natural. So even though radon's natural, the way we function with our buildings creates an unnatural exposure. Okay? Levels inside can reach high levels, and it just happens with the building design and construction. It's not that someone's designed a bad building, and it's not that someone's constructed a bad building. It's not the designer's fault. It's not the builder's fault. It's just going to happen. As we move towards a more carbon neutral environment, which greenhouse gas control and carbon fossil fuel reliance is decreasing, that's very important. We need to do that. But as we do that, we tend to tighten buildings so that they can be more energy efficient. That can lead to higher indoor radon concentrations. So that's something to remember. A lot of people think, well, it's just the cellars, the basements that we need to worry about. Okay. And usually cellars and basements do test higher, but that's typically because they're closest to the source of the radon, and they tend to be less ventilated than the rest of the building. But that's not always the case. It's important to realize that high concentrations still exist in buildings without basements and in buildings with adequate ventilation. Okay. I have lots of case studies if you want to get into it. But in-ground ducting, that's the worst, right? That can be a big concern. Okay. So what are the recommended exposure limits? Well, in Canada, it's 200 becquerels per cubic meter. In the US, it's 148, and that's just because of a metric imperial conversion. Think about it as 150 if you want. And World Health Organization, a lot of people say it's 100. That's the target, but it's actually 100 to 300 because there's certain places in the world and in the country that you just can't get it below 200. Okay. So Canada's kind of smack dab in the middle, Health Canada. But remember that radon is radiation and it's a cancer-causing agent. And with all other carcinogens in the workplace, asbestos, benzene, you name it, as low as reasonably achievable applies, because the health impact is so significant. We want to make sure that we reduce the exposure as low as possible. Every time you cut your radon dose in half, you cut your risk in half, right? It's a linear, no threshold dose curve, so it goes straight to zero, right? So let's say we've tested our building. We've determined what are our results. Well, if you're less than 200, Health Canada, you don't have to do anything, right? You're more than welcome to if you want to decrease your level and follow a LARA principle. You're more than welcome to. If you're between 200 to 600, Health Canada recommends you fix the building within 2 years. So there's no need to panic. Let's just get a good plan together and fix it. And if you're above 600, they recommend fixing it within a year. So where do you test? Again, if basements aren't always the problem. The overall goal is to test all the lowest occupied rooms in the building and to cover the entire footprint. That's the gist of it. We'll get into a lot more detail in webinar 2 on what that's like. But if it's a slab on grade, you're testing everything on the main floor. If you've got an office in the basement, for example, that's where you would test. The area over here that you see isn't occupied, so you test above. And you don't test above the office because you've already got sort of the worst case scenario there. So that's generally the gist. If you've got a parking garage in your building, which some of the larger commercial buildings do, you don't need to test that. However, if you've got a security guard and a kiosk down there, that would be a workplace and they would need to at least test the kiosk, right? Or there's a lot of car washing and detailing companies down in some of those parking garages. That's their workplace. That would need to be tested. Okay. And an occupied area, or what's deemed occupied, is a room or an area that an individual occupies for 4 hours a day or more. Okay. Now, there's some other sampling limitations you need to be aware of because you can get what's called a short-term test or a long-term test. And people like short-term tests because it's quick and they get their answer. But radon concentrations in a building fluctuate dramatically hour to hour, day to day, and season to season. So if you test for a short period, which would typically be a few days, you can run the risk of getting a false high or a false low. If you get a false high, you're spending money fixing a problem that you may not have. Okay? But Health Canada's major concern, and anyone who's worried about a worker exposure, is if you test falsely low, you don't fix a problem that you do have. So how do we fix that? Long-term testing. And Health Canada prescribes that a long-term test is anything that's 3 months to 12 months. Okay. And it's typically conducted in the heating season, which is October to April, because in the heating season, windows and doors are closed. The temperature differential outside is higher, so that stack effect that pulls the radon in is stronger, right? And we're less windows open, so less fresh air diluting the building. The other thing to consider too is there's frost in the ground. So that radon that would have naturally escaped through the ground tends to concentrate a bit underneath the frost. So that's one of the reasons why we tend to see higher readings in the winter months. But that 200 becquerels is your average annual exposure. So if you want to get as accurate as possible, you test for 12 months, and that's what you can compare to. But that can be a little unrealistic for a lot of commercial applications. There are short-term tests, and they're technically anything that's less than a month. They're usually 2 to 7 days. Health Canada says you can't use them to determine whether you should or shouldn't fix a building, but we do use them. One, if a building's high and we fix it, we want to know that we fixed it right away and we brought the levels down closer to where they need to be before we expose people for 3 months. So as mitigators, we use that as a quick check to say, yeah, we've brought the levels down, and then we always follow up with long-term. We can use it with diagnostics if we're trying to figure out where is it high in the building, where is it coming in, what the issue is. So we use that for diagnostic purposes in the intent to fix the building. And if you're doing a residential property transaction, there is a short-term test for real estate guidance for that transaction. But in Canada, those are the only times we use short-term testing. And there's lots of ways to test for it. This is a few. The basic technologies are an electret ion chamber, which is basically this device here, this thing called an EPERM. alpha track detector, which is the primary one that we use, especially for commercial buildings and long term. That's one. There's one. There's one. There's one. There's a bunch of different ones out there. Charcoal scintillation, which we typically don't use or shy away from in Canada. There's some challenges associated with that, and some accuracy challenges. It's a big mechanism in the States because they use that for real estate transaction, but we typically don't use it in Canada. In continuous radon monitors, there's lots of different types. You can get home versions of this off the internet for, a few $100s. They're, reasonably accurate enough, but they're not a professional grade one, and you can't use that for workplace exposure. The professional grade ones are usually closer to a couple $1,000s, right? So very, very different instruments, and not really economical to use the electronic monitors to test every room in a building. Okay? So the one technology that we use mostly is an alpha track detector, and we've talked about alpha radiation being the issue. So what an alpha track detector consists of is basically 3 pieces of plastic. There's a housing, and the ambient air diffuses into that housing, and in goes the radon with it. And inside it is a plastic film or foil, whichever you'd like to call it, but it's similar to the materials that your glasses are made out of. It's a sensitive plastic. And as the radiation decay happens, nuclear decay happens, those alpha particles slam into that film or that foil and make tiny little craters or tracks, right? Just like a meteor would slam into the soil, this big alpha particle slams into the foil and makes a track. And that's what you see with those pictures above. Those are the tracks left on the film. So this goes to the lab. They enhance those with acid etching, and then a computer controlled microscope counts them, and they do some math, and there's your concentration. So that's generally how it works. So they don't emit radiation. They don't collect radiation. They're not a miniature camera. They're not a voice recorder. So if you're ever testing, you can assure people that these simply take the measurement. So you've got an outcome with a building. You're either going to have radon that exceeds the action level, or you're going to have radon that doesn't. You're probably going to find a concentration. It's unlikely that you'll find non-detect. But if you're below the action level, simple, no one's overexposed, you don't need to do anything. Carry on using the building as you would. If you change the use of the building, or you renovate the building, or change the ventilation, retest it, right? Because that can affect radon. But if you do have radon, you have a couple options, right? You can change the use of that building or discontinue the occupancy, right? Maybe it's a workshop, and it's not worth trying to fix it, so you just turn it into storage, okay? I don't think you could ethically just sell it to somebody else and sell them their problem, but don't use the building. The other one is worker exposure control, and that would be done through the norm guidance, which is naturally occurring radioactive material, which is in, you guessed it, webinar number 2. But basically that would be similar to having your commercial workers at the office wear radon dosimeters, like if they were working at a nuclear power plant. Very administratively heavy. That's something you don't want to get into. The best and most likely route is to mitigate the building. So you do some work on the building to get the radon levels below 200, and then you don't have to do anything. That makes the sense. The other option too is, let's say you're a bank, for example, and your radon's at 400. You could double your staff, and they could only work half their shifts. But that doesn't make a lot of sense either. But if you have high radon, have no fear. It's fixable. I haven't seen a building that we haven't been able to fix yet. And I know there's some mitigators on the call here that would probably agree. Been involved with the industry for a long time. We can fix it. This is my house. And when I tested my house, my new house, and this was a house that was built to LEED Gold certified standard. So, and I had an HRV in it, under slab insulation, 6-inch spray foam. So, every building science geek thing that you could do to build an energy efficient, well-ventilated house. And I still blew over 270 becquerels. So that debunks the myth that I've got an HRV, I'm well ventilated, I don't have a problem. You have to test. So what do you do to fix it? Okay, and you can do this in a commercial building. This is just an easier example. The best thing to do is active slab depressurization. You can call it subslab depressurization. There's a couple different names for it, but basically you're reversing that stack effect, right? You core a small hole through the floor, you dig out a portion of soil to make a negative air plenum, you insert some sealed inline piping, you run that piping to a sealed inline radon fan, and you exhaust it outside. You're allowed to exhaust horizontally to the ground. That's something that's developed in Canada, and there's ways to do that. This shows it exhausting to the roof. When I installed this system, that was the standard, and my son's window was right up here, and I actually liked my neighbor, so I extended it a little bit further. But basically what you do is you put a small pressure underneath that, right? Quite small. The fan typically for houses 35 cubic feet per minute kind of thing, an inch or two of water column, so not a really big fan. Runs about 30 watts, so it's like leaving a light bulb on all the time, not a huge energy impact. But what happens is you put suction underneath the floor, and it's not so much evacuating all the radon, but it's changing the pressure. So you're pulling some of the house air underneath the slab instead of the house sucking the radon in. That's really what's happening. Okay. So I mitigated my house. You can see how it comes out through the floor here, right? Punches out into my garage. There's the radon fan here. You can see my cursor punches out through the sidewall and up to the roof. And I dropped my house to about 10 becquerels. So basically non-detect. I'm as good as outdoors now. And I, as a parent, rest easy. We did a grab sample underneath my floor before we started this. And you can see here that the radon pinned at close to 9,000 becquerels under the slab. After we put the system in, we let it run for a day or a few days. Those levels underground dropped to about 400. So that's a washout effect. And if by chance the radon, slurps in under a little bit of circumstances, it's coming in at far less concentration, so far safer. There are other methods. There's constant dilution ventilation. If you want to cut your radon level in half, you have to double your air changes in your house, right, or your building, and you can do that. You can also have your system run dynamically with some devices called radostats or radon stats. This is just a trademark of one that's on the screen here, but it's works just like a thermometer or a thermostat, sorry. It measures radon in the building continuously, and when it approaches a certain level, it pilots the ventilation system to call for fresh air, gets diluted, and it shuts off that call for fresh air. And this meter is apparently smart, so it can sort of view trends and it can optimize its energy over the time period, but you're still pulling in a lot of fresh air. You haven't solved the radon getting into the building. You're just, your solution to your pollution is dilution, right? So there's pros and cons to all these, right? A lot of people say, well, let's just seal out the radon. It's never going to happen. It's typically not likely. If you have radon that's a little bit over the action level and you got a big hole in the floor, like an open sump pit or a crawl space or something, sealing that might make the difference. Very unlikely though. People want to go here because, it's typically low to moderate costs. Any handy person can, grab a tube of caulking and seal a crack, right? There's no energy cost to it, right? You fix it with the building and it controls radon at the source, which is great. But the problem is it's extremely tedious work. Most people don't have the experience to seal the basement or the cracks the way they need to be sealed to be durable and to last. Because you can seal it and the caulking can fail 5 years later and you have a problem again. So you have to maintain this stuff still. A lot of the openings aren't available. There's a lot of basement areas where the drywall wall's up. You can't access the areas that really need to be sealed. And it's virtually never, ever affected by itself. We always seal openings when we do a mitigation because that makes the mitigation more effective. And it's just a smart thing to do. But trying to eliminate radon from entering the building through just pure construction practices and sealing, I can guarantee you right now, it's probably never, ever going to work. Active depressurization, explain the situation to you, what that's about. It's extremely effective. We see 90 to 95% reductions 80 to 90% of the time. So incredibly effective. Controls radon at the source. So it never gets in the building. Your workers or your occupants aren't overexposed. That's great. It's just like a fume hood, right? There is some energy consumption, but it is quite low. Again, small fans, you lose a little bit of conditioned air, but not a big deal. And it's usually not too expensive to install. People think it's a lot, but it's not that bad. Some cons, it requires some power to operate, but again, not a lot. You lose a little bit of conditioned air, but again, not a whole lot, especially if you're doing it properly with certified professionals. Can be a little bit more difficult in a commercial building than a house, but again, I spent 7 years doing this on commercial banks and commercial buildings across the country, and it's not daunting. It's not overwhelming. It's very manageable. It does require some piping to be installed to the outside, so there is some disruption to occupants, but we can manage that. Increased ventilation is the other option. A lot of people tend to want to gravitate towards this, but why? Because it's usually a simple adaptation to your ventilation system. Or they figure, oh, I got that dynamic pilot. It's going to be all my energy savings. It's going to work great. I'll just put that in and it'll only call for air when I need it. That's helpful. And typically the install cost can be moderate and not a lot of disturbance to building occupants. The biggest thing is your impact to your energy cost. If you double your air changes to cut your radon level in half, you're basically doubling your heating and cooling bill, right? Instantly. And you're cutting the life expectancy of your ventilation system roughly in half because it's working twice as hard. So there are those things to consider. Additional cost, additional hard work on your HVAC system, decreased life expectancy of your ventilation system, moisture implication issues that could lead to mold. So increased ventilation is great, but it's not always a magical fix. And it can be very expensive in some buildings. For example, if you have a very minor ventilation system, it's not robust, you might have to install a brand new ventilation system, and that could be far more than active slab depressurization. One key thing to remember, though, is the rheostat, and I'm not picking on it. It's a great tool. It activates at 150 becquerels. So if you decide to use the World Health Organization as your action level, like one of my clients did at 100, that meter will never get you below what your target is. So you have to be aware of that. Okay. Testing for radon in the workplace. In Canada, our workplaces fall under two broad occupational health and safety laws. If you're a federally regulated workplace, then you fall under the Canadian Labor Code and the Canadian Occupational Health and Safety Act. If not, you fall under whatever your local, provincial or territorial occupational health and safety legislation would be. Federal is pretty straightforward. Part 10, 26, subsection 4 says no employee other than a nuclear energy worker shall be exposed in the course of any year to concentration of radon that on average over the year is higher than 800. Now, it's important to realize that this is the old wording. In October 2023, they harmonized with Health Canada and it's 200. So a lot of people say, I'm not going to do anything until the regulation changes. Well, this regulation has been in place for a long time. And to say you're not going to do anything until the regulation changes, the only thing that's changed is the action level, right? The only thing that's changed is the speed limit, right? You always had the duty to assess this, right? So just changing from 800 to 200 doesn't change your duty as an employer if this regulation applies to you. And if you don't know, you don't test. Or if you don't test, you don't know, sorry, right? So you could easily, I have lots of federal clients that I know of that could have easily been over 800, that were easily over 800. They didn't know, they didn't test, so they were non-compliant, right? So, and in provincial, CELA, the Canadian, or CELA, however you'd like to pronounce it, the Canadian Environmental Law Association did a review of all Canadian law. It's a great document. It's 300 and some odd pages. If you'd like to read it, go ahead. I've read it all, so don't, again, Radon Geek. So don't spin your wheels. I can get you the highlighted sections that are relevant to you. But all provinces have a requirement to assess hazards in the workplace Well, first of all, to identify them, then assess them, and then control them, right? That's general occupational health and safety requirement, right? And so all that exists somewhere in some mechanism in whatever province or territory you're in. And none of those exclude radon, right? Specifically. So radon's not exempt from that. So the Ministry of Labor or WorkSafe BC, wherever you are, would use that mechanism to invoke Health Canada's norm and make you do some work if they ever got a complaint. Okay. Now, those are the same mechanisms provincially that would direct us or mandate us or make us clean up mold. Because there's no mold regulation in Canada. There's no mold acceptable level in Canada. It's the same mechanism in legislation, right? And we wouldn't dream of not cleaning up mold. The only difference is you can see, smell, and taste mold. You can't see, smell, and taste radon, right? And for the most part, radon-induced lung cancer or radon-induced illness is a compensable claim. Okay, so in summary, radon, it's in all buildings. You don't know how much unless you test. Workers require protection from radiation and radon-induced lung cancer. Indoor levels of radon need to be measured to know what's there, and elevated levels need to be reduced, or you need to control that worker exposure somehow. Okay. So there's some additional resources here for you. Naomi, would you mind just cutting and pasting those resources into the chat so that people can find them? You're more than welcome to call me. I love to talk about this stuff and to help people out, give them good advice and good options. So please feel free to contact me at any point in time. But Karst and C-NRPP have incredible resources available for you. Okay.
Absolutely can do that, Bruce. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi.
And we have just a couple of questions here in the Q&A. So a reminder that if you do have any questions, either raise your hand and I will unmute you, or we will answer them from the Q&A panel. And if we don't get to your questions today, we will endeavor to follow up with you, or we will answer them at the next webinar. So the first question we have is from Abdus Shinwari. Does transportation contribute to radon accumulation? I'm not exactly sure
Transportation,
what
I'm
he's getting
thinking
at there,
like
but
planes, trains, and automobile transportation. And if that's the case, no. But if you're talking about mass transport of soil gas through the building envelope into the building, yes.
okay, thank you. The question from an anonymous attendee: how do we firstly find out if the building or house is having a radon leak? I think we kind of covered that there in the webinar, but
Yeah, the
just
soil gas is going to find a way in, so just test, right?
test, always test.
Yeah.
Haitham Hannah, thank you for your question. He has two here for us. They said if radon is mainly generated or gets sucked into the basement, why do we continue to have most of the air circulation, especially residential, pass through the basement, which is in most of the time not inhabited? Really good question.
Well, because when you're ventilating a building, you have to treat a building as a whole, and an unventilated basement can build up moisture and other problems, right? So mechanical engineering and building science has evolved to address mold problems. So it's important to ventilate the basement, right? Especially if it's occupied, because those occupants need air. But radon is strongest or highest at the source, which is in basements. It is a heavy gas, but a typical ventilation system or normal air movement within any building is more than enough to push it and distribute it around. So trying not to ventilate a basement isn't going to necessarily solve your radon problem. I've looked at lots of places where the basement isn't ventilated at all, or there's a crawl space underneath, and the radon is high in the upper levels. So very complicated with ventilation systems. Great question. But a good answer. One of my mentors told me the best answer for radon a lot of times is yes, no, maybe, sometimes, and depends. And that's because there's so many factors that affect it. You got to treat each case a little, by itself.
Great answer. Thanks, Bruce. Just a reminder that if anyone does have questions, to use the Q&A panel versus the chat. It can be a little complicated because we've got a few things going here, but thank you for that answer. And another one from Haitham there. Apologies if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but according to the presented information, I guess geothermal fields under buildings can highly increase the radon concentrations inside these buildings. Many boreholes are 600 feet deep. Should radon sensors be installed at the basements of buildings with geothermal systems?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never had that one. Um, so I'm not a geologist, so I can't get into all those details of how that geothermal system would work. But really what it comes down to is every building needs to be tested. So every building should be tested, regardless whether there's um, some mechanism underneath that might make radon more prevalent than another building. So test, test, test.
Hmm. Yeah, fantastic question. Thanks, Hytham. Kevin Parks, when Bruce vented to the roof, did he need to? Could this pipe be vented or fanned anywhere outside?
Great question. When I did that was decades ago when I put that system in. That was sort of the standard at the time. Health Canada has done a lot of studies with NRC, and they basically you can exhaust radon very similar, the same way you would to any natural gas appliance. So very similar to the way a furnace would vent. There are clearances and distances, and they're provided in CGSB standards, Health Canada standards, etc. So you just want to make sure that you're exhausting the radon, it doesn't get sucked back into the building. And obviously pay attention to what's going on. You don't want to exhaust it right by your kid's sandbox, right? Or right by the office smoking area. So, use some judgment there, right? Now, again, there are some building code standards. If you go to ASHRAE, you can get stuck with 30 feet away. But again, that's the whole mitigation side, and I can ask those specific questions. But no, you can discharge differently. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And Dan added the highest point question mark here, and I think you just answered that as well. Sam asked us about schools. Are there any instances of high radon levels you've come across in schools? If so, what are the regulations for testing for radon in school?
Yes, absolutely. There's high radon levels in some schools. Most provinces across the country have tested. Ontario tends to be very much behind. What legislation comes into play immediately for schools is workers. Your teachers, your custodial staff, they're workers. They are afforded the same protections under the Occupational Health and Safety Act of the province as any other worker. As far as legislations go with the school's requirement to protect children, that's a different set of legislation that's outside of occupational health and safety. But the schools do typically have duties to protect the health and safety of the students. Right. So,
Thanks, Bruce. We have a question from Atif Mohammed here. Would you recommend that radon testing be included in DSS reports? And they add that given that radon is not a designated substance, other areas of concern such as mold and nuclear materials are also evaluated as separate sections within a DSS report.
yeah, designated substance reports are fantastic. They're great. They serve a purpose. Their purpose is to protect construction workers when they're doing renovation from, designated substances, primarily asbestos, lead, mercury, and silica. I think under the circumstances, your best bet in any time you can recommend to a building owner or operator to protect their workers. Yeah, that should happen. Could you do it in a DSS? I think if you're doing a DSS, your purpose would then be to do construction on the building. I think your best approach there would be to, after that construction's done, test the building, or test the building before, and then while you're doing construction, mitigate it. So sure, you could. It's just a timing issue with the client and what makes most sense, I think.
Thank you. We have a question about, on average, how much does the installation of depressurization like the one you did in your home cost? Who does the installation? We have another question around cost for sampling my property October to April approximately. And another one sort of related to that as where in Ontario should I not buy a house based on radon? So a couple of related questions there. I wanted to
Okay.
just post them all for you to answer at once.
I'll answer the last one first. Don't let a location of purchasing your dream house mess with you. If you find your dream house and it's in a high radon area, I suggest you just negotiate some stuff off the cost of the house, do that short-term real estate test. But again, as I said before, we haven't found a house or a building that we haven't been able to fix. So if you find your dream home in your dream location, Don't let that stop you. The radon can be fixed. Can you remind me of the other questions, please, no? Or can
Yep,
I?
absolutely. So they're more cost associated ones. Cost for
Oh, yes.
sampling property. How much does the installation of a
Yes.
depressurization system cost?
Yes. You can go, Health Canada has posted some numbers. They're a little older, but a typical system like I installed in mine would be similar to installing a furnace. So you're looking at about sort of the $3,000 to $5,000 range. Remember, building materials have gone crazy over the last little bit with COVID. So the best thing is phone your C-NRPP certified mitigation professionals, because that was the other question, who should do it? A certified professional. You get what you pay for, right? They know what they're doing. They're very efficient. They put in the lowest cost energy system for you, and they make sure that you're not causing other problems with carbon monoxide backdrafting and things like that. But that's typically the way it is. If you've got, for example, though, a house that has an earth and crawl space, you don't have any concrete there, you're going to put in a membrane and you're going to depressurize that membrane. So that's a lot more material, a lot more work, and that can accelerate. So the best thing to do is get a number of quotes from C-NRPP certified mitigation professionals. The association has a very robust process of addressing complaints and making sure that clients are taken care of. Commercial buildings, very broad. They can range from $20,000 to $50,000. The highest one I ever did was closer to 200, but that was a heritage building, so it was historical. We had to vent up 3 stories. There was asbestos removal, aesthetic issues and matching of various things we had to do. So that's an extreme case. So commercial buildings, very hard to give of a range, right? But not worse than any other type of construction work.
Thank you, Bruce. It sounds like there's a lot of information and a lot of different answers to these questions. There's a lot that could be said about testing, and we do have quite a lot of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is we're running right up to our time here. So we're going to follow up with you guys who've asked questions on an individual basis, and then we're going to look to cover some of the answers to these questions in our next webinar. So please do come. If I can just get you to flick to the last slide
Oh, yeah,
here,
sorry.
Bruce. I wanted to let everybody know about webinar 2. So please do come next week, same time, Wednesday, September the 25th from 1 to 2 p.m. You will receive a reminder email with a link to join. Actually, you probably would have gotten it about 45 minutes ago. So you can use that same link to join next week. Feel free to pass on the invitation to any of your contacts or colleagues that you think would get value from this particular webinar. Bruce is going to be diving into radon regulations and your responsibilities. So as a property manager, developer, construction professional, or a consultant, everybody has different responsibilities covered under different regulations, and we should be aware of those as we go forward. So again, I just wanted to thank everybody so much for coming today. Thank you for all your questions. Sorry that we didn't get to them all, but we'll make sure to follow up with you guys. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.